They told the story in whispers, as if speaking it aloud would make the curse stir again. Imagine this, 41 men, women, and children, standing under the July sun of 1876, and by nightfall gone. Not a single scream recorded, not a body left to bury, not even a shoe in the dirt. 41 lives erased from a Kentucky plantation that was supposed to be a shining example of progress after the Civil War. The official records say they simply walked away, abandoning their contracts, fleeing north. But you and I both know that is not how history works. No one leaves behind their children's clothes. No one abandons wages they desperately need. No one vanishes in silence unless something greater than fear is commanding it. And what if I told you the silence was ordered? That the sheriff's investigation was crushed in just 3 days by the magistrate himself? That in the bowels of the Beaumont Manor beneath timber and limestone there were letters, hidden in the walls for generations, that tell a story darker than any ledger, darker than any official record? Letters that speak of rituals, of watchers on the hills, of men in black coats who arrived uninvited, yet moved like they owned the land. History wants you to believe in progress. It wants you to imagine that the plantations were relics of the past, that labor contracts replaced the chains of slavery, and that prosperity was shared among the willing. But here, on 3,000 acres of tobacco fields, something else was growing. Something not written into law books or farm records. Something older than the war, older than Kentucky itself. A system that fed on human obedience and demanded human disappearance when obedience faltered. The men of Bourbon County whispered that Jeremiah Beaumont was too successful, too integrated, too bold in his defiance of the old ways. Former slaves working side by side with Irish immigrants, poor whites finding dignity on land once watered by their blood, challenged the order. And when men challenge the order answers back, not always with guns, not always with rope, but with silence, with shadows, with the clean erasure of 41 names. Tonight, you are not listening to history as it was written. You are listening to the wound that was buried. You are standing at the edge of a field where cicadas screamed in the heat of July, and then fell silent, as 41 souls stepped into the darkness that claimed them. And once you hear what the letters say, you will understand why silence was the only option the powerful could allow. Jeremiah Beaumont was not the kind of man the county elites wanted celebrated. He was cunning, yes, ruthless when it came to profit, but he was also too clever to be predictable. His plantation had become a strange experiment, a place where freedmen and Irish laborers, widows and orphans, mountain folk and city drifters all worked side by side. To outsiders it looked noble, almost utopian. But utopias are the first thing that power destroys. Do you see the pattern? Whenever a man builds something that unites the divided, he paints a target on his chest. And Jeremiah's target was glowing in the eyes of those who still fed off the fracture of America. The summer of 1876 should have been his triumph. The fields were lush, the barns heavy with the scent of tobacco leaves curing into wealth. But wealth is never just crops, it is people. And those 41 workers were more than hands in the dirt. They were proof that the old hierarchy was crumbling. Every day they earned wages. Every day they broke bread together. Every day they erased the myth that one race, one class, one bloodline was destined to rule. To Jeremiah, this was business. To the men who met in secret halls, this was blasphemy. The newspapers began to circle like vultures. Harrison Crow, the local editor, published venom disguised as commentary. He spoke of unnatural experiments at Beaumont's fields. He warned that the sight of freedmen working beside whites would corrode society. Do you think that was his own idea? No, that was the whisper of power, written through his hand. Editors were weapons, sharpened by those who owned them. They laid the groundwork: demonization, suspicion, fear. Once you mark a place as unnatural, the public looks away when unnatural things happen there. And then came the riders. Not hooded this time. These men wore suits, broad hats, polished boots. Witnesses described them as gentlemen. But their eyes were wrong, flat, cold, without hunger or warmth. They came not to buy tobacco, but to measure the plantation like surveyors of destiny. They spoke to no one, left no names, but the workers felt their presence long after the horses disappeared down the roads. Patrick O'Sullivan wrote to his sister that week, "They watch us like hawks. They do not smile. They do not speak. They only count. Count. That is the word. They weren't men at all, not in that moment. They were keepers of balance, sent to weigh 41 souls on invisible scales." Jeremiah thought he had built a business. He had unknowingly built a stage. And soon, the curtain would rise on a vanishing act written not by nature, but by power itself. The last day they were seen alive began like every other, and that is what makes it unbearable. The dawn was soft, golden light spilling across the rows of tobacco like a promise. The air was already heavy, damp with a heat that clung to the skin. Workers filed into the fields, their tools glinting in the first sunlight. Children laughed as they ran between the rows. Mothers sang hymns to keep rhythm in their labor. Nothing about that morning foretold annihilation, and that is exactly how annihilation prefers to arrive. At midday, under the broad oak trees near the manor, they gathered for their meal. Cornbread, beans, buttermilk, the simple food of survival. Yet even as they ate, unease spread. Martha Caldwell whispered of strangers she had seen on the road. Pale-faced men in dark coats, watching from a distance. Samuel Rutledge, the field supervisor, tried to calm her fears, insisting they were buyers. But his voice carried no conviction. He had noticed them too. They didn't watch the fields. They watched the people. After the meal, the bell rang, and the workers returned to the fields. The sun pressed down with merciless heat. Sweat poured from every brow, stinging eyes, soaking clothes. Still, the crew worked with endurance. They joked, they sang, they cursed the weather. Yet by sundown every sound would be gone. Not one song, not one curse, not one cry for help. Silence swallowed it all. Because when the bell rang again that evening summoning them to the general store to collect their wages, 41 names should have been called. 41 hands should have reached for coins. But the store stood empty. The cabins stood empty. The fields stood empty. It was as if time had swept across the plantation and stolen only the human shapes, leaving tools dropped in the soil, food half-prepared on wooden tables, children's shoes by cabin doors. Jeremiah rode hard across his land that night, his horse foaming with sweat. He shouted their names. He searched the barns, the woods, the creek beds. Nothing. No footprints in the mud. No broken fences. No drag marks. No fire. Gone. Clean gone. And that is the detail no one forgets. The precision. Disappearance without struggle. Oblivion without trace. When the sheriff came, he stayed 3 days, then closed his books. He called it flight. But the families knew better. The soil knew better. The letters in the walls of the Beaumont Manor knew better. They spoke of something orchestrated, something rehearsed, something too exact to be chance. 41 workers had not fled. They had been taken. The letters were not meant for you to see. They were meant to rot in the plaster, sealed behind beams of oak and limestone, a secret entombed with the house itself. But secrets never stay buried, not forever. When renovations cracked open the old walls of Beaumont Manor nearly a century later, folded scraps of parchment slid to the floor. Ink faded, paper brittle, but the words still cut with the sharpness of dread. They were not written by Jeremiah. They were written by the workers themselves, in desperation, as if they knew something was coming. One letter, penned by Patrick O'Sullivan, begins like a prayer. If these words are found, then know we were not faithless, we were not runaways. Something hunts us. They watch us at night, standing where the firelight fades. Their faces pale, their hats broad, their silence heavy. They do not eat. They do not speak. They only count. He underlined that word again and again, count. Another fragment, scrawled in the shaky hand of Martha Caldwell, speaks of children waking from nightmares that felt too real. They screamed of men outside the cabin windows, whispering in a tongue no one knew. Samuel Rutledge wrote of a night when he followed the sound of horses and saw torches burning in the distance. Not clansmen, he knew their ways, their violence. These were different, organized, dignified. The torches were not for terror. They were for ceremony. The letters reveal patterned circles drawn into dirt, stones stacked in strange formations at the edge of the fields, animal bones found outside the cabins in precise arrangements. The workers were unsettled, but they could not leave. Contracts bound them, debts weighed on them, hunger anchored them. And Jeremiah, blind or unwilling, dismissed their fears as superstition. He believed in commerce, not curses. But commerce is only another ritual, and Jeremiah's land had become an altar. Do you see it yet? This was not random disappearance. This was collection. The letters describe being observed, measured, prepared like a harvest. Not of tobacco, but of people. The fields were only a cover. The barns only a stage. Beneath it all was something older, an order that predates nations, wars, and contracts. An order that feeds not on money, but on silence. And that silence was bought that night in July, when 41 names were struck from the record. History tells you they ran. The letters tell you they were chosen. Chosen for what? That is the abyss we step into now. To understand what happened on that land, you must strip away the illusion that America was ever free. The Civil War ended slavery. Yes, but the systems that demanded human sacrifice, obedience, and silence did not end. They simply changed their face. Plantation became corporation. Overseer became official. Shackles became contracts. The machine still required fuel, and sometimes that fuel was human life. What the Beaumont letters whisper is not just a tragedy of 1876, it is a pattern repeating across centuries. Entire communities erased from records, mass disappearances called migration, villages wiped from maps with a single stroke of ink. Always the same story. No graves, no justice, no memory. Why? Because memory threatens power. To keep power clean, you must keep its victims invisible. The rituals described on that Kentucky soil were not invented there. They echo older patterns, European blood rites hidden under the cloak of nobility, ancient fertility sacrifices dressed up as harvest festivals, secret societies that marked their allegiance not with words, but with silence. Look closely, and you'll see the same signatures. Gatherings at night, fire encircled with stone, the counting of souls as if each were currency. Kentucky was not a random place. Its limestone-rich earth, its caves and waterways, have long been tied to rituals of resonance, of energy. The Beaumont Plantation was not just a farm, it was a node in a network, a stage where the old order fed itself under a new nation's flag. Jeremiah Beaumont thought he had mastered the Reconstruction economy. He thought contracts and wages made him untouchable. But the truth is, no man builds without permission from the unseen. His plantation united what was meant to stay divided: black freedmen, poor whites, Irish immigrants, widows, orphans. That unity was dangerous. It broke the spell of separation that kept the powerful in place. And when you break the spellbreakers come for you. Not with armies, not with proclamations, with precision, with erasure, with silence. Think of it this way. The tobacco harvest was a cover. The real harvest happened at night. 41 souls gathered by unseen hands, counted and removed from the ledger of the living. No bodies, no graves, no witnesses. Only silence. And silence, my friend, is the purest mark of power. Now, ask yourself, if this was only one plantation, how many others were silenced the same way? How much of history is missing not because it was never lived, but because it was erased? The night of July 23, 1876, falls like a shadow that still stretches across Kentucky. Imagine it. The sun setting over endless fields, the last glow fading into red, the workers finishing their shift, weary but satisfied. They gathered at the general store, as they always did, to collect their wages. Coins exchanged hands, laughter floated through the dusk. Children tugged at their mothers' skirts for sweetbread. Nothing unusual, nothing foreboding. And then, without warning, the pattern broke. The bell rang again. Once, twice, 3 times. Too many times. The sound was sharp, metallic, not the ordinary rhythm of the plantation bell. Samuel Rutledge, the field supervisor, was the first to notice. He said the bell felt wrong, as if it wasn't calling them but summoning them. Witnesses never spoke of what happened next in public, but the letters tell us in fragments. The workers began to move, not of their own will, but as if pulled by an unseen thread. Some described it as compulsion, others as dread that pressed them forward like a hand at their back. Torches lit on the edge of the fields, not carried by workers, not by locals, but by strangers. Men in broad hats, their faces pale in the firelight. Silent, waiting, arranged in a perfect circle. The workers walked toward them, not screaming, not resisting. That is the detail that chills the blood they obeyed. Not because they wanted to, but because they could not disobey. Martha Caldwell's fragment stops mid-sentence. The children are walking into the dark. I try to hold the ink trails into nothing. Patrick O'Sullivan wrote, "We follow as though asleep. They count us in silence. We are not names to them. We are weight." By midnight the cabins stood empty. Food half-cooked in pots. A lantern still burning. Tools abandoned in the soil. And in the field, nothing but scorched grass where the torches had stood. The workers had not run. They had been taken swallowed by the ritual of counting, of weighing, of erasure. Jeremiah searched until dawn. He screamed their names, his horse breaking through the rows of tobacco like waves through water. But the fields answered with silence. Not even the insects stirred. The night had been claimed. And when he returned to the manor, exhausted, he found the front door ajar. Inside, a single word was scratched into the wood, deep and deliberate. Balance. Balance. That word, carved into the Beaumont Manor door, was no random mark. It was not a threat. It was not a warning. It was a declaration. The men in black coats had not come to destroy. They had come to adjust, to weigh and measure, to remove what they believed tipped the scales. 41 workers, men, women, children, were not victims of chance. They were sacrifices to equilibrium. But whose equilibrium? Whose scales? Understand this: power never tolerates imbalance. The moment Jeremiah's plantation became an example of unity, it disrupted the fracture that kept wealth and fear in place. Black freedmen working beside white mountaineers, Irish laborers breaking bread with widows of Confederate soldiers. It was a small crack in the wall of division. And cracks spread. If Beaumont succeeded, it could replicate. If it replicated, it could spread across Kentucky. If it spread, the old order would collapse. So the order responded. Not with violence that leaves evidence. Not with massacres that inspire rebellion. No, the method was silence, because silence cannot be resisted. When a man is murdered, his family cries out. When a man disappears without trace, his family doubts, hesitates, fractures. Doubt is more powerful than bullets. Doubt paralyzes. Think of the psychology here. The workers were erased as if they had never existed. Contracts canceled. Debts wiped clean. Records altered. The county magistrate closed the case in 3 days, calling it abandonment. And what does abandonment breed? Shame. Families left behind were told their loved ones had fled, faithless, ungrateful. Widows were whispered about. Children were called orphans of cowards. Do you see the brilliance? The victims were made guilty of their own vanishing. Balance, then, was not just about removing bodies. It was about restoring obedience. A message delivered without a word spoken. Step too far outside the lines, and you will not die, you will be forgotten. No monument, no grave, no legacy. Just absence. And absence terrifies more than death. This is how power maintains itself. Not always with laws. Not always with armies. But with silent, strategic silence that keeps men looking over their shoulders, wondering if they will be counted next. Jeremiah thought he owned his plantation. But the mark on his door told the truth. He was only a custodian of land that answered to older masters, masters who would decide when the scales tipped too far. The Beaumont disappearance was not an isolated wound in history. It was a link in a chain that coils through America's soil, binding events that historians still refuse to connect. Look closely at the years after the Civil War, and you'll find gaps where there should be graves. In Mississippi, entire tenant camps reported as migrated north, though no wagons were ever seen leaving. In Alabama, A freedmen's settlement of 32 souls vanished overnight, their cabins left intact, their tools untouched. In Tennessee, railroad workers Irish, black, poor white disappeared mid-shift, their tracks unfinished, the company records rewritten to say they had abandoned their posts. Do you see the pattern now? Abandonment, always the same word. A linguistic weapon that places the blame on the vanished. They did not die, they did not resist, they abandoned. That single word erases outrage, erases investigation, erases memory. To the public, it looks like failure of character. To the families, it feels like betrayal. And in both cases, the silence of power is preserved. The Beaumont letters reveal the ritual beneath the word. The counting, the torches, the circles in the soil, the men in dark coats, pale and silent, weighing not individuals but groups, harvesting entire crews. And when you match these whispers with other disappearances, the echoes grow too loud to ignore. In every case, the victims were integrated. Black and white laborers working together. Immigrants and freedmen sharing wages and bread. Unity was always the common thread. And unity was always punished with silence. Think about that. The Civil War had ended the institution of slavery, but the machinery of division was still sacred. The ruling order could tolerate violence, it could even tolerate poverty, but it could not tolerate solidarity. Solidarity was the true threat. When men stop seeing each other as enemy and start working as brothers, they break the spell. And when the spell breaks, the keepers arrive to restore balance. So the question becomes, who were these keepers? Were they local elites, cloaked in ritual to disguise their violence? Were they secret societies, blending the old European orders with new American power? Or were they something older still, something that does not shift with politics or geography, but feeds eternally on silence and erasure? The newspapers mocked Beaumont as an experiment gone wrong. But what if it had gone right? What if the plantation had become proof that America could reinvent itself from the ashes of war? That possibility was too dangerous. And so, 41 workers became the price of balance. The men in black coats, the keepers, did not kill with bullets or knives. Their weapons were far older, far more precise. Control, erasure, fear. They understood something most people never grasp. A man who knows he can be forgotten is a man who obeys without question. Power does not need to crush bodies. It needs only to remove certainty. And when certainty vanishes, the mind begins to fracture. Fear becomes instinct. Compliance becomes survival. The letters speak of it, though carefully, as if admitting the truth aloud might summon it again. Patrick O'Sullivan described feeling drawn forward by invisible hands, compelled to follow orders he never heard spoken. Samuel Rutledge wrote of the torches in the field and how they felt magnetic, pulling them step by step. Martha Caldwell recounted trying to resist, trying to clutch her children, only to find herself moving as if sleepwalking. Every witness became a participant in their own disappearance. This is the brilliance of psychological control. It doesn't force you, it seduces, it coerces, it guides you into a predetermined outcome. And notice the elegance of the system. No bodies, no blood, no rebellion. To the outside world, nothing happened. To history, nothing was recorded. The vanished were blamed for leaving. And in that vacuum, power grows. Absence is stronger than presence when it carries the weight of doubt, shame, and unanswerable questions. This is why history has been so willing to forget Beaumont. Not because it was inconvenient, but because it was instructive. The disappearance is a lesson. Integrate when you are allowed, obey when you are commanded, and never presume that progress is yours to claim. The keepers measure, they select, they remove, and they always leave a message for those who remain. Unity without permission is a risk you cannot survive. And yet, in this calculated cruelty, there is revelation. The letters preserved the truth. They show us that man is not powerless, that the machinery of control can be seen, studied, understood, that the disappearances were never random accidents, but indicators, warning markers in the landscape of power. When we read them, we understand the system, and understanding is the first step to defiance. Remember this, the keepers are not myth. They are pattern. They are method. And they are patient. Their work is slow, deliberate, exact. The moment you assume history is done, that the scales are balanced, that the past has no teeth, you forget the most important rule. They count. Always they count. Counting. It sounds harmless, almost mundane, but here it is lethal. In the Beaumont letters, the word appears again and again, underlined, circled, whispered in margins. They were counted once, twice, again and again, not as workers, not as humans, but as units. A number in the ledger of power. Their value assessed, their presence measured, their existence weighed against some invisible scale no one alive could see. And when the total tipped, when the sum threatened the equilibrium of the system, the removal was inevitable. Think of it like this. Every gesture, every smile, every shared loaf of bread was catalogued. Every integrated action, every moment of cooperation between races and classes was an input into a calculation the keepers understood. They did not arrive because Jeremiah owned land, because he grew tobacco, because the crops were profitable. They arrived because 41 souls on that soil had created imbalance, and imbalance, in their eyes, must be corrected. The ritual itself, as described in the letters, was meticulous. Torches lit in precise formation, figures moving in silence, the circle drawn with care, hands extended as though measuring something invisible. The workers stepped into it willingly, or at least under compulsion. Eyes wide, hearts hammering, yet unable to resist. Each footfall was counted, each name registered in an order older than the nation, older than the soil itself. And when the final number was reached, the field was empty. The barns were empty. The cabins were empty. 41 lives wiped clean of the ledger of the living, erased from the narrative, made to vanish into the shadow of balance. Do you feel the weight of it? The psychological precision is terrifying. No one needed to die to instill fear. No bodies were necessary to maintain control. The system teaches compliance in advance. Everyone who watches the disappearance knows what happens to those who step out of line. The very idea of autonomy becomes dangerous. And that is the genius of the keeper's method. They do not merely punish, they educate. They sculpt reality itself so that men obey, even when the threat is invisible. By this point, you may be feeling something shift inside you. That unease, that creeping awareness, is exactly what the keepers count on in the living. But here you are different. You are awake. And those who are awake begin to see the ledger, the invisible scale, the pattern. Before we continue, type in the comments, "The scale watches twice." Say it once for recognition, and a second time to seal your awareness. This is not superstition, it is alignment with the truth. Only those who acknowledge it can perceive the full depth of what follows. When the sun rose over Beaumont Plantation the morning after July 23, 1876, it revealed nothing. No bodies, no struggle, no sign that 41 lives had been erased from existence. The county responded as if nothing had happened. The sheriff closed the investigation after 3 days, citing abandonment. Magistrates endorsed the closure, scribbling it into official records with the calmness of men approving accounts. And the newspapers? They spun the story into morality tales, warnings about unreliable laborers, cautionary fables of the poor who wandered north. Families returned home in disbelief. Mothers searched for children who were never in the cabins. Husbands went to find wives who never woke from the fields. Each question was met with shrugging shoulders and polite denials. The power of the keepers is most evident here. The world itself conspires to erase, to rewrite, to normalize. Absence becomes fiction. Tragedy becomes legend. And in that vacuum, fear thrives. Letters hidden within the walls became the only testament that these people had ever existed. They were testimonies of lives measured, lives removed, and lives remembered only by ink and memory. Samuel Ruddle's wife cried herself to sleep for weeks, unable to believe that her husband, her children, her neighbors, could vanish as if swallowed by the earth. She whispered their names over and over, invoking them into the wind, as if speaking could reconstruct what the keepers had dissolved. The pattern of silence is deliberate. County leaders, neighbors, and even historians prefer the convenient story that the workers fled. that they abandon their homes, their contracts, their lives. But in reality, the silence is engineered. It is a psychological trap for the living. It teaches obedience through absence, instructs compliance without force, and ensures that the system endures unchallenged. Yet there is a stubborn truth. The keepers cannot erase curiosity. Every generation that reads those letters, every historian who digs too deep, every person who refuses the narrative of abandonment, awakens the memory of what was done. The shadows of those 41 lives linger in the soil, in the trees, in the scent of tobacco leaves left to rot in old barns. They linger in the knowledge that power is not always seen, but it is always counted. This aftermath is the lesson buried in plain sight. The disappearance was not just a crime. It was a demonstration of how easily humanity can be removed from history when it threatens the order of the powerful. And now that you understand, you are standing at the edge of that same lesson. The Beaumont disappearance is a window into a much larger system, one that stretches across post-Civil War America and beyond. Consider this: labor contracts, local magistrates, county records, even newspapers. All of these institutions appear neutral, administrative, mundane. Yet in the hands of the keepers, they become instruments of erasure, each piece reinforcing the other. Contracts bind bodies. Records rewrite reality. Newspapers shape perception. Every disappearance is thus invisible to the world that accepts the system at face value. This is how control survives, generation after generation. Not through overt brutality alone, but through subtle orchestration of belief. A worker who fears being labeled abandoned obeys before a hand is ever raised. A family who doubts their own memories resigns themselves to silence. A community told the vanished left of their own volition ceases to ask questions. Power becomes self-enforcing, invisible, yet omnipresent. That is the system. That is the order the keepers maintain. And the pattern repeats. Integrated communities vanish when they challenge hierarchy. Immigrants disappear when they demonstrate unity. Voices of dissent are quietly removed before they can be heard. Each act of removal is carefully calculated to ensure obedience among the living. Each absence is a signal. We watch, we measure, we decide who stays. 41 workers on a Kentucky tobacco plantation were only a single node in a network of psychological and institutional domination that spans decades, centuries, even continents. What makes this particularly insidious is the illusion of normalcy. The world around Beaumont carried on. Markets opened, crops were sold, families went to church, politicians debated Reconstruction. And all the while, an invisible mechanism was at work, quietly pruning the landscape of human presence. Its method is simple but devastating. Eliminate the exception, enforce compliance, and let silence do the rest. By studying Beaumont, by reading these letters, by seeing the precision of the counting, you glimpse the machinery of power that rarely shows itself. You see the intersection of psychology and institution, ritual and bureaucracy, fear and obedience. It is not myth. It is method. And it still exists today, in hidden corridors, in silent decisions, in the erasure of inconvenient truths. And now, having followed the trail this far, you are no longer an outsider. You are awake to the system. You have glimpsed the ledger. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Awakening is not gentle. It is not gradual. It is a shock to the system, a rupture in perception. When you confront truths like Beaumont, you realize that most of what you believe about order, fairness, and history is constructed, curated, and controlled. 41 lives erased, the records rewritten. The families silenced, all of it a demonstration of power far older than the plantation itself. When that knowledge hits, it changes how you walk through the world. You begin to notice the invisible levers, the quiet manipulations, the spaces where control thrives unnoticed. This is why the keepers fear awareness more than defiance. A man who sees the ledger, who understands the counting, is already halfway outside their system. Knowledge becomes armor. Understanding becomes resistance. Once you recognize the mechanisms, the contracts, the silence, the rituals, you see the patterns in other places too. Corporations, governments, media. They all have scales, all have balances. They measure, they count, they select. And every day, The system silently decides who remains visible and who vanishes. The letters themselves were meant to preserve the memory of the workers, to awaken the world to the method behind their disappearance. But the message is subtle. They cannot call out the keepers openly. Such words would invite attention, retaliation. Instead, they encode the lesson in observation, in pattern, in repeated phrasing, the counting, the torches, the circles. To read the letters is to participate in the transmission of forbidden knowledge, to step across the threshold from ignorance into awareness. This is why I ask you now to reflect. Consider what it means to be awake in a world designed to keep you blind. To see the machinery of control and still move freely with intention. To recognize the vanishing points in history and understand that they are not accidents, but teachings. You are no longer a passive observer. You are a participant in the ledger of knowledge. And remember this, awakening carries responsibility. Once you perceive the patterns, the silence, the counting, you cannot return to the complacency that sustains the system. You have been marked by awareness. The scales have noticed you. The system will test you. But this is the moment when a man begins to reclaim his agency. The methods that erased 41 workers on the Beaumont Plantation have not vanished with the decades. They have evolved, refined, and embedded themselves deep within modern institutions. The keepers do not need torches or circles anymore. They have technology, bureaucracy, and media to achieve the same ends. Disappearance is no longer physical. In many cases, it is social, digital, financial, psychological. A man removed from the ledger today is silenced through character assassination, through erasure from networks, through calculated misinformation. The principle is identical. Measure, count, decide, and vanish. Think of how the world treats whistleblowers, activists, or anyone who unbalances established systems. Contracts are enforced with lawsuits. Records are rewritten in databases. Social reputation becomes currency, and when it is withdrawn, a person is effectively erased. Patterns repeat, centuries apart, in new forms, proving that the keepers are not bound to time, they are bound to method. Silence remains their most powerful weapon. Obedience their most effective outcome. And as before, the world is trained to believe the vanishing is voluntary, a natural consequence, a personal failure. In this context, the Beaumont letters become more than history. They are a manual, a mirror, and a warning. They reveal the architecture of control, how absence itself can be weaponized, how fear can be sculpted with invisible hands. They ask a question we rarely dare to ask. What truths have we accepted simply because they were written by those who count? How many lives have been erased quietly, whose names we no longer remember, whose stories we cannot tell? And yet, knowledge remains power. By tracing the steps of the 41, by following the ledger backward, forward, and sideways, you gain insight into the enduring mechanisms of control. You see the design behind the erasure, and in that seeing lies the seed of resistance. Understanding the keepers is not about defeating them in a single act, it is about refusing the illusion of ignorance, refusing to normalize their methods, refusing to forget what they want buried. You have reached the edge of awareness, the precipice where history, psychology, and power intersect. You are no longer the man who listens to stories of disappearance and moves on. You are now attuned to the counting, to the patterns, to the invisible ledger. And in that attunement, you begin to reclaim agency in a world that teaches you to obey through silence. Now you stand at the edge of what most men never reach. You have walked the fields of Beaumont, followed the footsteps of 41 souls erased, read the letters hidden in walls, felt the weight of counting, and seen the invisible ledger that governs obedience and erasure. This is not a story to entertain. This is not a lesson in history you can forget by the morning. This is a rite of passage. The knowledge you now carry is dangerous because once seen, it cannot be unseen. Once understood, it cannot be ignored. The world wants you blind. It wants you distracted, divided, and obedient. But now you know the pattern. You know the mechanics. You know that silence is a weapon, absence is authority, and the keepers measure and remove not through chaos, but with precision. 41 lives in Kentucky remind you that compliance is taught long before any order is spoken. And the lesson is not distant. It is alive today, encoded in systems, institutions, and interactions that seem mundane until you recognize the ledger behind them. The final truth is this: power is not given. It is maintained. And to challenge it, to navigate it, to exist awake within it, you must first accept that you are being counted. Every action, every alliance, every word spoken in ignorance or truth feeds the scales. Once you know this, once you acknowledge it, you begin to see openings, fractures, and the rare moments when the ledger can be influenced, manipulated, or even rewritten. Awareness is the first form of defiance. Remember the torches, the circles, the counting. Remember the silence that followed. Remember the invisible hand that guided 41 into erasure. Let it guide you now, not in fear, but in understanding. Because comprehension is power. And the man who understands the ledger, the counting, the pattern, has already reclaimed the first measure of control the keepers will never willingly relinquish. You are no longer the man who listens passively. You are awake. You are counted, yes, but you are also present. You are aware. And in that awareness lies the spark of autonomy, the seed of resistance, the potential to step outside the machinery of control. 41 vanished in silence, but you have been given the gift of sight. You have been initiated into the ledger of forbidden truths, and nothing from this moment on will ever be the same. Now that you've glimpsed the ledger of the Beaumont disappearance, ask yourself, how often are you counted without realizing it? How often do you obey silently, unaware of the scales measuring your choices? If this shook something inside you, type "the scale watches" in the comments. Not once, but twice declare your awareness, mark your presence, and align yourself with knowledge others will never see. If you want to go deeper, subscribe and turn on notifications. We're uncovering the hidden systems that govern power, control, and silent stories that aren't in textbooks, whispered in private, and sealed away from most eyes. And if you truly want to step beyond the surface, share this video with someone ready to see the ledger with you. Awareness is contagious. Knowledge is a weapon. The choice to remain awake starts now.